You want me to drive?
In my head.
Hello everybody, welcome to In My Head. Two quick things. The first, I'm from the United States of America, so if you're from a different country or a different culture, the things that I say here, they may not apply the same for you. The second, I'm not a licensed professional. Here on In My Head, I give my take on mental health issues, and today we're going to talk about the brilliant idea that helped me with my driving phobia. So for those that don't know, a phobia is an irrational fear of something. So it's not just like being afraid of heights, because generally being afraid of heights is a normal fear. We're afraid of falling. That's an innate fear that every human being has. But a phobia of heights would be not even being able to approach something that's high, or not even like being afraid of the thought of being near anything that's high. That could be an irrational fear, because if you have a guardrail in front of you and you know that that guardrail is stable, then there's no reason to really be afraid. Now for myself, I had a driving phobia, and what I want to say quickly is that phobias, they don't have to exist like all by themselves in a vacuum. We tend to think of somebody like that's afraid of snakes or something, and that's it. But sometimes a phobia can arise with a lot of other different complications alongside of it. So you could have something like PTSD, you could have intrusive thoughts, you could have generalized anxiety. Generally, we're talking about anxiety here, panic disorder. Phobia doesn't have to exist on its own. There could be other factors that are reinforcing that phobia. Now I want to walk you through my history of how I think that phobia started to develop. For me personally, I was always kind of afraid of cars. I did the normal high school driving lessons, and I was terrified then, and I was probably terrified then because I had anxiety in general. I wasn't that comfortable in school. If I didn't have a driving phobia, I mean, I guess I was irrationally fearful at the time because I knew what I needed to do, but it wasn't really a phobia the way it became later. So over the course of driving, I had a few minor accidents, but accidents rattle you up a little bit. I didn't develop PTSD, I don't believe, from any of those, but they were enough of like a shock to me to make me uncomfortable. And I also was in a relationship with somebody who would harm me while I was in the car, distracting me from being able to drive the car. I think that is something also that factored into me having this driving phobia. So it's kind of like these things started to layer on top of each other: the general discomfort, the accidents, being harmed while I was in the car. And this is all stuff that happened across over a decade, like over 10 years we're talking here. Eventually I wound up with an ex who used to drive the car for me. They weren't so comfortable with me driving the car. I'm not exactly sure why, if that was their own thing. They said that it was their own thing, that they just felt more comfortable with them driving. So I was more than happy to let them do that because I was already uncomfortable with the car. Unfortunately, what this did, because this was a long relationship that I was in, was I just got used to handing it off to them, and I was not practicing being in the car. I wasn't practicing being comfortable driving the car. You know, I was still driving. I obviously took myself places, but it was less often than I normally would. And I was getting comfortable with having them do stuff. So I lessened my exposure to the experience of being in control of the car. So put that together with everything else, and I started to develop this driving phobia, where I was now afraid of driving a car, even though I knew how to drive a car, even though I sometimes would take myself places. It was a frightening experience for me. And I think that's something that is important to note here, is that you can have a phobia and you can sometimes still be around that thing and still have the irrational fear. And I know that kind of goes against our traditional wisdom of how these things work, but for me, I could still go ahead and drive, but then like my anxiety was up here, and I was very uncomfortable while I was doing it. And very often I'd have like intrusive thoughts coming in that I'm gonna crash, and I'd visualize the crash, I'd visualize what was gonna happen. I just wanna kind of debunk this idea that just because you have a phobia, that means you never do the thing that you're afraid of. That's not true. Sometimes you can do it. You're just probably not that likely to do it. Something else that I should mention is that at that time I was living out on Long Island. I still live out on Long Island in New York, and I've had experience driving into New York City, driving through New York City. So very congested area. Long Island has a lot of traffic and New York City is known for having traffic. That's just where I was at the time. I had this irrational fear that even though I've done these things plenty of times, it was still incredibly intense and frightening for me to be in a car. So this all came up when I was in couples therapy and I was in an individual session with the therapist. And I don't even remember exactly why it came up, this driving phobia thing. Maybe she was just exploring like the general issues in our relationship, but I explained it to her and she is the one who had the brilliant idea, the thing that really helped me move forward and get past this phobia of driving. So just to add a little bit more context, at the time I would like hesitate to leave the house. I just want to make clear, like, yes, I was driving, but I would spend a half an hour at least like working myself up. I would think hours beforehand about like, what am I going to do? How am I going to drive there? Where am I going to park? Like everything went through my head. Like things that you don't need to necessarily think about. Like if I was going to a place where I was already familiar with and I knew the parking lot, like what was I so worried about? But that's what a phobia is. It's an irrational fear. Okay, so this therapist had the brilliant idea, and please stick with me. The idea was basically gradual exposure therapy, but it was for me to do by myself, at least to try by myself. Now I had heard of gradual exposure before. It wasn't like a new concept to me. I was like, okay, great, she wants me to go drive, but she explained it in a way that I was like, oh, okay, that makes like way more sense than what I thought gradual exposure was. So that's what I'm going to explain to you here now. So what she wanted me to do was something, again, I've heard this before, like name the situations of what made me uncomfortable. Like start at a 1, something that's like barely even uncomfortable. Maybe like thinking about a car or something like that. Maybe 2 is walking up to a car. Maybe 3 is stepping into the car. Maybe 4 is putting on a seatbelt. Maybe 5 is turning the key on. Like whatever it is, it's going to be different for every person. And maybe 10 is like heavy traffic, horns going around you, switching lanes, not knowing where you are, that kind of a thing. So you could just kind of figure out where that is for you. And then you have to do the exposure part. This is the part that nobody likes, but it's just the way that you acclimate yourself, the way that you get accustomed to, the way that you get comfortable with doing what you're afraid of. So the exposure part, I usually thought of exposure as great. You're going to like throw me into like the worst situation. I'm going to have the highest anxiety. And I'm going to hate this, but I'm just going to bear it out, and then eventually the anxiety is going to go away. And that is a form of exposure, and that is helpful for certain people. I didn't want to do that. I didn't like that idea. That's not what this was. In fact, one idea that we actually didn't go ahead with, but is related, it was to do like a visual imagery thing. And actually, I did do this a little bit at home outside of session, but she was suggesting that we could sit across from each other and she could walk me through visually walking up to the car, getting in, sitting down, putting the seatbelts on, turning the car on, and then driving to a specified place. And your brain, it knows the difference between reality and the imagery, but it doesn't know enough of a difference. So when you practice that enough in your head, and you do it in a calm way, you don't do it in this frantic, like, oh my gosh, what am I going to do? That would be the purpose of the therapist being there, to guide you to stay calm during the whole experience. When you practice that enough, your brain kind of starts to solidify it, and then doing it in reality is not as hard. So that was one thing that she had suggested that we did not go through with, but what she did suggest, the brilliant idea here, this gradual exposure, this is what worked for me. So she didn't tell me to go to like number 10 on the list and throw myself into those situations. She told me, go to like number 3 or number 4, something that's like mildly uncomfortable. So I think at the time for me, a 3 or a 4 was like driving 10 minutes away or something like that. I knew I could do that. I knew it would be uncomfortable, but it wouldn't be like a full freak out. It wouldn't be like I would have to prepare myself for an hour to leave and get in the car. So I was like, okay, that's like a 3 or 4 for me. And I'm like, where's she going with this? So she explained to me, what you do is you do the 3 or 4 thing. You do it a couple of times to the point where it drops down and it becomes like a 1 or a 2. Like it really isn't an issue at all anymore. And then once that happens, everything else on the scale also slides down. And then you just go and do the 3 or the 4 thing again, the next thing that's a little bit uncomfortable. So if driving away 10 minutes was my 3 or a 4, I just had to drive away 10 minutes from where I was, do it a couple of times, do it repeatedly, get used to it, then it would become a 1 or a 2, and then I could do something like drive 20 minutes away. And I was like, really? That's it? Like, I just have to be uncomfortable? I don't have to throw myself into the situation and like bear it all and survive it and get like to me it was like this fight that I had to do. And no, I didn't have to do that. So that's what I did. I drove to stores 10 minutes away. Like, you know, I knew I needed like a couple of things. I was like, okay, instead of asking my partner at the time to go do it, I'm going to go ahead and do these things 10 minutes away. Got it. Okay, I know I can do this. I'm a little uncomfortable, but I did it. And then I repeated it. When there was a day and I didn't need to do it, I would visualize it. I'd sit down for 10 or 20 minutes and be like, okay, let's just pretend that we're going. And I'd close my eyes and I'd picture myself in the car, like actually driving there. Like I'd picture the different steps and the different turns and everything. I was like, okay, I can do this. And then sure enough, after like a week, I came back and I let her know it was going okay. And then she didn't even really tell me what to do. I just continued doing it. I was like, okay, I'm going to go 20 minutes away. And then something had happened where an event was coming up, and this was in Brooklyn. And at the time, that was like a 2-hour drive away from me. It was also at night, but I really wanted to go. And I kept flip-flopping back in my head, what am I doing? What am I doing? Because the day had come and I was still kind of terrified. And I was like, because, you know, I had only been driving like 20 minutes away, not 2 hours away, and not in Brooklyn, where I was not familiar with the area at all. And I knew I could do it because, you know, like I said, I've driven to New York City. I've driven around all these things before. I'm like, I don't know. This is a little bit much. But last second, I said, you know what? Screw it. I'm going to do it. I went. I got lost a little bit when I got there. It was okay, though. And I enjoyed the time, and it was stressful, but it also was okay. Like, it wasn't as stressful as it would have been because I had been practicing the 20 minutes away. Now, that's not to say that everything was completely smooth. There was another time that I was driving a friend to a train station. We were going into New York City, and on that ride, because I was particularly stressed that day, my anxiety, I remember telling her, like, I'm at around a 7 or an 8. And I just was saying it out loud because I wanted myself to be aware, and I wanted her to be aware where my mind was at. And then it also kind of helped me to kind of let her know, like, don't distract me, please. But got through that. That was okay. And I encouraged myself to tell myself, like, it's okay. I can do this. I've done it before. And through doing that and through keeping myself calm and making sure that I was, like, breathing slowly and not picturing the disasters, but picturing that things were going to go right, I calmed my system down, and my system got used to seeing the car not as a place that disaster was going to happen, not as a place where I couldn't do things, where I was going to seize up and withdraw and feel small, but as a place where I was capable, where I could actually enjoy having the music on and looking around at the different things in front of me and not feeling like it was the worst thing in the world, like I had to avoid it. So that brings me to today. And today I don't hesitate to get in the car. I really don't think that much about where I'm going. Like before, I would plan the night before, like needing to know every single detail. And I still plan, you know, I still look things up on the map, and I still there's like a little bit of anxiety, but it's really not a lot of anxiety. It's totally manageable. Now, don't get me wrong. If I have to drive into New York City or through New York City somewhere long distance, somewhere I haven't been before, there's a little bit of anxiety. It freaks me out a little bit, but I weigh my options. You know, I may decide not to do something because it's too much of a hassle, but that's something I would have done anyway. That's not a phobia reaction. That's just like, this is too stressful. So I still don't like traffic just like anybody else, but I don't like try to avoid traffic. Like, it's not an issue. This stuff just isn't an issue in my life anymore. And that's amazing because it opens up possibilities for me that if I want to go somewhere last minute, if I have something I need to do, then it's just not an issue. That's how it should be with something that's as important in my life, at least where I am, to be able to drive. I will mention something else that helped me though, was I got and this was actually after most of the work, but I do find it helpful. I got a holder for my phone so that I could see my GPS like right there in front of me, just glancing over while I'm driving. So I don't have it like down. I'm not trying to like reach for it and like check it quickly while I'm in the middle of driving. So that helps a lot. That mitigates some of the anxiety, but that wasn't like the thing. The brilliant idea was taking it just little teeny tiny steps. I never thought that you could get over something what felt to me so large in such small incremental steps. Remember that something that I had to do here was to really start paying attention to what level of anxiety I was at and what the number was for me. I labeled 1 to 10. That's just easiest for me. If that's something that you have trouble with, if you have trouble noticing your stress level, I have free worksheets on that over on my Patreon page. Why not check those out? On Patreon, I support others doing work that they love, and my patrons help to support me here in making videos like this one and my mission of humanizing mental health. Thank you to my patrons as always. If you like learning about mental health, I have tons of videos. Why not head over to youtube.com/RyanLiberty, go hit subscribe. And let me hear from you. I'd love to know. Do you have any extra tips when it comes to a driving phobia or phobias in general? I'd love to hear your experience. Leave that down below. Thank you for joining me, everybody, here on In My Head. I'm ready. Let's go.